Okay, guys, welcome to General Psychology. We're going to be going over chapter 1 today. It's that first introductory chapter. Okay, as you recall, I am Dr. Freddy Aviles. Okay, so chapter 1, we're going to be talking about all of this stuff. And we're going to try to get it out of the way today. Okay, and hopefully we have some time for questions at the end. Please save your questions. Do not ask them while I'm recording. Okay, so we're gonna define psychology and talk about the goals, a little bit of history there, and then talk about some different fields in psychology, different areas. Okay, so it's just basic stuff. It's basically, this is what psychology is. And here's some people that you'll learn about later. Some of them you won't, some of these people will mention. And here's, different areas within psychology. So here's our definition. What is psychology? There's the definition that is actually in your textbook. That psychology is defined as the scientific study of mind and behavior, according to Spielman, 2014. That is the author of your textbook. Remember, your textbook is an OER, an open educational resource. It's free. It's available as a PDF. And I will point out right away that I am giving you examples of how to give credit to an author in APA style, how to cite an APA style. And that's how you do it. Author's last name, comma, space, the year, in parentheses at the end of the sentence. You can do it that way. There's another way to do it too, but that's one way to do it. And I'm going to be showing you examples throughout the semester. So by the time we talk about APA style, it'll be clear to you how you give credit to an author. So it's a definition, right? That's the author's definition. So psychology is the scientific study of the mind. It's about basically how we think, and it's about behavior. It's about what we do. But there is something that seems to be missing there, because I'm a psychologist, and I know that psychology is a scientific study of what we do, okay, how we think, and how we feel, okay? I think feeling is missing here. Mind and behavior, that's how we think and what we do. But there's also our emotions, how we feel. But you'll find out when we talk about emotion that according to theory, emotion is made up of both thought and physical responses within the body. So I guess it's probably covered in that definition. So what is psychology? Psychology is about how we think, how we feel, and what we do, to put it simply. Scientific study of mind and behavior, according to the author. What do we do with psychology? What are the goals? One thing we want to do with psychology is describe, okay? Let's stick to behavior to make it simple. Let's say we want to describe behavior. So in other words, what does aggressive behavior look like? Or let's say something that's a bit more complicated, depression. What does depression look like? What is depression? We want to describe it. Another thing we can do is try to predict behavior. Who's likely to become depressed? Who's likely to become aggressive? Who is, likely to be more difficult? Who's more likely to get divorced? Psychology is used for all those things. We can also try to explain things. That is more difficult. To explain means you want to find out the causes of things, okay? So like the causes of behavior, the causes of aggressive behavior. What causes aggressive behavior? It's actually a bunch of things, okay? Or what causes autism? That is still, and something that, all these things are ongoing, but autism, our understanding of autism is changing and growing, and definitely some biological stuff going on there. By the way, it's not vaccines, okay? Just so you know, the scientific evidence does not support that. But when we're talking about explanation, we're talking about what causes something, okay? And we're talking about cause and effect. And there's only one type of study that tells you about cause and effect, and that would be an experiment, okay? But we'll get to methodology later, okay? Not this week. Another thing we can do is to try to influence behavior, hopefully in a positive way. Maybe we can make somebody less aggressive. We can make it so that a marriage is more likely to last, or less likely, or people are less likely to get divorced. Make people better parents, make it so that children behave better and are more likely to do their work, right? There's a lot of things we can do that are on the influence side. We can use influence for bad things as well, if we choose to. Okay, there are ways to irritate people and to bring out the worst in people. We're going to learn a lot about why people are the way they are. And, you know, this knowledge can also be used for bad things, okay, or things that I consider to be not so positive. You know, there's television commercials, you know, or ads, you know, trying to sell you products. Guess what? They're using psychology, and they often know what they're doing, and they very often fool you into buying something that you really don't need, okay? Let's keep going. I've said too much about that already. Let's keep going. Let's talk about a little bit of history, psychology's roots. From speculation to science. Yes, psychology started with just speculation. In other words, psychology started more as a philosophy. And this is somewhat, you know, kind of maybe of a biased viewpoint, okay? But, you know, Aristotle is given credit for a lot of things. You know, he lived in like the 4th century BC, and he was a philosopher. He had ideas about all kinds of things, and he had ideas about how the body and mind work. He had ideas about psychology, although the word didn't even exist back then. He believed that the heart is the source of personality. Your personality has to do with your heart, according to Aristotle, okay? And that's according to Myers in a book that he published in 2014, okay? So who you are, your personality has to do with your heart. You know what? We know that that's wrong now. Your personality has more to do with your mind, okay, than with your body. Sure, genetics have something to do with it as well, but no, your heart is not the source of your personality. Your heart is a pump. It pumps blood throughout the body. And Aristotle reasoned that basically, yeah, the heart must have everything to do with your personality, because when you're angry, right, your heart starts pumping faster. When you're in love, you know, your heart also beats a little differently. You know, it's like when you're sad, you feel it in your heart, right? You've heard that. But no, the heart is not where your personality comes from. But Aristotle had some ideas about that, and he's given some credit, you know, for being one of those first people to start thinking about psychology. Someone who did some work more directly related to psychology, or at least some thinking, would be Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German, Wilhelm Wundt, long time ago. Well, he lived from 1832 to 1920. He's considered the father of psychology. It doesn't say that he's the father of psychology, but he's considered the father of psychology because he's the first one to make psychology a science by establishing the first laboratory that actually did experiments or studies, basically, that looked like they had something to do with psychology. So he carefully measured and observed some things. He did some experiments. His experiments don't really seem like psychology at all, but they are the beginning of psychology. One thing he did is he would drop a ball, and he had observers report when they saw it hit the ground. And he measured basically, the difference between when they saw it, when they reported to him, yes, it hit the ground, and the difference between when it actually hit the ground. So the difference between sensation and perception. I'm not explaining this very well, but he was doing something weird like that. He was looking at how people's senses work. It seems more like a hard science, but he's the first one that had a laboratory where he was doing things that seemed to be about psychology. We'll talk about sensation and perception in a different chapter. He did some experiments, he observed some things, so he's considered the father of psychology. By the way, if you see the name William Wundt, that's the same person. William is the name in English. Wilhelm will be the name in German. So I guess it started in Germany, okay? Believe it or not, a lot of things were happening in Germany. You know, early on, a lot of great minds come from there. The birth of a lot of science is actually in Germany, but I'll say more about that in a little bit and why that changed. Some of you already know why that changed, because eventually, you know, that the U.S. became basically the, kind of the dominant place, or the just the place where, I mean, where more of the discoveries were being made, where the sciences were being advanced more later on. And there's a very good reason, not what I'm going to say good, but there's an important reason for that. So I'll say that in a moment. Okay, now, so Wilhelm Wundt was the father of psychology. And now I'm going to tell you guys about structuralism. Structuralism was one of those early ideas about psychology. Structuralism is a school of thought or a way, an approach to psychology where they're concerned about the structure of things, as the word implies. So Edward Teichner was the one most closely associated with the movement or the school of thought or the way of thinking known as structuralism. Teichner used introspection to develop an idea about the mind's structure, okay? So he used introspection. He had his participants look inward and he asked them basically, well, how does this feel to you? What are the images that come up? Things like that. He was trying to figure out the structure of the mind, okay? He reasoned that the mind structure is composed of sensations. That is what you see, hear, taste, smell, you know, your senses. Images, again, what you see, and your feelings, I guess your emotions about things. So if you look at this, and that's according to Myers 2014, if you see this little girl here, she's smelling a flower and she's closing her eyes. So what are the images that come up when you smell a flower? Okay, so there might be some colors that you see, you know, right, when you close your eyes in your mind. Feelings, maybe some feelings of happiness, if it's a sweet smelling flower or something like that. The sensations, you know, the smells, all those things. So what is a thought? According to Teichner, thinking has to do with psychology. According to Teichner, a thought is composed of sensations. Okay, so your senses, images that you see, you know, in your mind, and feelings, your emotional reaction. So he's doing something difficult, right? Trying to figure out what is the composition of a thought. It's an approach to psychology, you know, like it's as if it was a hard science, right? They're trying to figure out the structure of a thought, you know, and it's not a very good approach for psychology, but structuralism works very well for the hard sciences, like chemistry. What's the structure of water? We know it's H2O, 2 hydrogen and an oxygen. Works very well for hard sciences, right? But psychology, can we really approach it that way? It's a start, right? And it does have its uses, okay? Later on, you'll learn that, yes, according to theory, emotions have a sort of structure, a composition. Emotions are made up, according to one theory, of thoughts and biological reactions within the body, those two things, okay? But we'll talk about that later in the semester. So that's Teichner. And then a little bit later came William James. That's a self-portrait there of William James. William James advocated a school of thought or a way of thinking, an approach to psychology known as functionalism. So it's about how things function. Now, I will tell you early on, when we're talking about this little bit of history doesn't sound like psychology at all, okay? But it will sound more like psychology in a little bit. So functionalism, and I know it's not that interesting, this history, okay? The school of thought, right, you know, where the approach that psychological processes have a function, helping us survive as individuals, adapt as a species. So according to William James and those that advocated for functionalism, basically thinking, you know, basically helps us survive as a species, helps us adapt, okay? Now, this probably reminds a lot of you of evolutionary theory, how the adaptation of a species, right, allows it, adaptation over time, okay, allows the species to survive and reproduce and then pass on its genes, its biology basically to the future generation, to its offspring. William James here is trying to basically apply kind of an evolutionary approach to psychology, saying that our thinking basically helps us survive and adapt long enough for us to basically reproduce and then pass on our tendencies to the next generation. According to Rathis, 2014, right? That's what William James said. Okay, so it's like an early approach, an early attempt at evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is actually a field within psychology now that's much more advanced than this early thinking. But that's what William James contributed. Let's keep going. And then we have Freud, right? You probably have all heard of Freud. Freud is one of those early figures in psychology. Everyone's probably heard of Freud. He was a very influential thinker, but he's not the father of psychology. He's not the first one to try to figure out how the mind works or anything like that. But he's very popular, the best, not the best, the most well-known figure in psychology, okay? Freud lived from about the mid-1800s to basically right before, you know, actually World War II, you know, right around the time that World War II started, or right around then. You know, believe it or not, you know, the trouble started, you know, I mean, there was World War I, and then there was, by the late 1930s, I mean, you already had the beginnings of the, basically, of the problems that led to World War II. And believe it or not, the Nazis almost got Freud. You know, he was Jewish. They almost got him. He had to move to the UK in the later parts of his life because they wanted to kill him, okay? But he was a very influential thinker. And there's his first book that he published there, A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis. So as you know, as a lot of you have heard, Freud was a therapist, called himself a psychotherapist, and he proposed something known as psychoanalytic theory. According to Freud, the unconscious mind, in other words, the part of your mind that you don't control, that you may not even be aware of, and those early childhood experiences, those early memories, that is actually what shapes your personality and your development. That is what basically helps you, has the influence of making you into the person that you are today. The person you become has everything to do with your unconscious, those early experiences, those early memories. Okay, that's Freud. That's what he contributed. Okay, we'll learn more about his theory later on. Okay, we'll have a whole chapter on Freud. Okay, and then after Freud came Pavlov and Watson. There you have Pavlov there with the beard and Watson there with the glasses. Pavlov wasn't even a psychologist, but he contributed one of the most important discoveries, you could say, that has shaped the field of psychology. Pavlov discovered something known as classical conditioning, which is a type of learning. It's learning due to association, okay, to put it simply. Learning due to association with a previously neutral stimulus, okay, according to Thorne and Henley, 2005. See, that's how the way you cite two authors, both of their last names separated by an ampersand there. So Pavlov wasn't even a psychologist. He was a Russian physiologist. He was studying saliva and accidentally discovered a very important form of learning that basically has shaped the field of psychology tremendously, because those forms of that class conditioning allows us to understand the development of many psychological disorders and also how to treat them, okay? And a lot of things about how we feel and why we behave the way we do. A little bit later came Watson. Watson is considered the father of behaviorism. Behaviorism is a school of thinking that basically shifted the focus of psychology from the mind, so to speak, to behavior. Watson basically advocated that psychologists should just focus on behavior, only the things that we can see, okay, only behavior. And we'll learn more about Watson later, but he's the father of behavior. He's the one who came up with the word behaviorism, which is an approach to psychology. He learned about, you know, classical conditioning and some of the findings, early work of Pavlov, and basically, you know, from that point on, figured that, you know, this is exactly what we need to be doing with psychology. We need to focus on behavior. This tells us a lot about how humans behave and why they behave the way they do. More about him later. If you've taken a class, or maybe you will in the future, with John Vento, Watson looks a little bit like John Vento, who teaches at the college. Although John Vento's getting a little bit older, but he still when he was younger, he looked a little bit more like that. I've been here 16 years, by the way. This is my 16th year. He's probably been here a little bit longer than me. But yeah. Okay, and then Skinner, another important historical figure in psychology. You might have you know, heard of The Simpsons and Principal Skinner. Principal Skinner, I believe, is named after B.F. Skinner. But Skinner was one of these behaviorists, one of these psychologists that believed that we should only focus on behavior. We should not be focusing on the mind. We can't see the mind. So never mind that. Let's just focus on behavior. Skinner contributed a lot to, the development of the field. Skinner developed the principles, it says there, of behavior modification that are based on reinforcement and punishment. And learning due to reinforcement and punishment is called operant conditioning. And we'll talk more about Skinner later when we talk about the learning chapter, okay? And yes, Skinner used animals for his research. He used rats. He taught rats how to differentiate, for instance, between, let's say, a blue light, or let's say green and red, or a blue light and a red one, in order to get food. So the rat can learn, like, when the blue light is on, it can press the lever and it will get some food, or the rat can learn when the red light is on, do not press the lever, or it will receive an electric shock instead. Animals can learn from rewards and punishments, and so do we. And Skinner basically developed these rules or principles about behavior modification, how to change behavior based on rewards and punishment, okay? And there's actually therapies based on his thinking. We'll talk about Skinner later, okay? Later, after that, a little bit later, and some of these people lived around the same time, but they, advanced the field in their own ways. Abraham Maslow, okay? Where does it say Abraham Maslow? Okay, right there, Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow is most known for proposing the hierarchy of needs. Here's the hierarchy of needs, which some of you may have heard of. We'll actually talk about that when I believe it's during the chapter of emotion and motivation and emotion, okay? So Maslow falls under the school of thought or the way of thinking known as humanism. Humanism is an approach, or you can think of it as a theory, that emphasizes the potential for good that is innate to all humans. So for Abraham Maslow, human beings are basically good. They strive for growth and basically development. They strive to to achieve their full potential. And he proposed this pyramid that emphasizes, or that talks about, how we approach different needs. The most basic needs are at the bottom, and then the higher needs that fulfill us, that make us complete, are at the top. But we have all these needs, right? We have physiological needs, we have safety needs, we have belonging needs, that's the third step, social needs, we have esteem needs, things that make us feel good, and then we have self-actualization, when we become the person we're meant to be, when we achieve our full potential. More about Maslow later, okay? I told you guys, this first chapter is just one of those chapters that here's some people here that you'll learn about later, okay? An introduction. Carl Rogers also falls under the school of thought known as humanism, also believed in humanistic theory. Carl Rogers was a therapist, and so was Maslow, by the way. Rogers emphasized the potential for good that exists within all people. So again, that's the approach known as humanism. It's humanism, right? We're all basically good. We strive basically to be at our best. Rogers is best known for developing something known as client-centered therapy. It's a type of therapy where the therapist shows unconditional positive regard, genuineness, empathy. So we'll talk more about his approach later, his therapy and his theory. But basically, he developed a type of therapy that is driven by the needs of the client. In other words, the client, the person undergoing therapy, basically, the therapeutic approach works that they address and they talk about the things that the client needs to talk about, okay? If the client is feeling sad or angry, they'll talk about those things and address that. And it's basically an approach where the therapist shows unconditional positive regard. In other words, the therapist is not judgmental, doesn't try to tell the client what to think or what the problem is. It's an approach that has more to do with acceptance, basically, and self-discovery and being genuine and things like that. You'll learn more about it later. And you'll understand it a bit better later. But it's a very different approach, let's say, than the approach that Freud took. Freud just believed he understood human nature and how people develop and how people acquired their problems or their disorders. And he had very rigid ideas about why that was and what people needed to do in order to overcome those problems. Rogers' theory is not about that at all. It's more about a process of self-discovery, okay? And we'll talk about that later. And then we have Chomsky. Chomsky is one of these individuals that we will not talk about later. Chomsky is still alive. All those other people we talked about have passed on, but Chomsky is still alive. He's really old now. He's probably in his 90s. Noam Chomsky, born in 1928, so he's like 92 years old. Very influential in beginning the cognitive revolution. Chomsky was basically one of those people that really started emphasizing thinking. In other words, if we really want to understand people, we need to look at their thinking. For Freud, it was about the mind, right? And then came behaviors who said, no, you're right, it's all about the behavior. We don't need to worry about thinking, right? And then it eventually moved again back to thinking, okay, with Chomsky. But of course, in a much more advanced way, Chomsky is very well known in the area of language and basically, and just thinking, okay? This is a mural of Chomsky in some place. I don't see the little text there that tells us where that is. Actually, it's there somewhere. But that's Noam Chomsky. He's still alive, okay? And we will not talk about him later, but he does come up if you take a child psychology class or developmental psychology class. He's very well known in the area of language and had ideas about how people acquire language, right? You think about language, right? It's something we develop so effortlessly, that we learn so quickly and so easily. Why is that? Chomsky is an expert in the area of language, and it's all about thinking. Contemporary psychology. So today, what are some of the fields in psychology? What are some of the areas that you can specialize in? And these are not all of them, and these are broad fields, and there's subfields within these, okay? So it's just an introduction to psychology, okay? This first chapter. So we have biological psychologists, okay? Biological psychologists study the structure and function of the nervous system. Biological psychologists study the biology behind basically thinking and, you know, and reasoning and behind emotion and behind all sorts of things. We are biological, okay? We have bodies, we have brains, and these things have a lot to do with why we feel the way we do, why we eat what we eat, why we sleep, why we use drugs and how they affect us, right? You know, why we engage in sexual behavior or the kinds of sexual behavior. A lot of it is biology. Sure, you know, our thinking and our learning matters as well, but our biology is very important. You can't get away from it, okay? Some people are naturally more prone, for instance, to become addicted than others, okay? Your mind works a certain way, okay? So biological psychologists basically study the structure and function of the nervous system and how that affects our thinking, our emotions, our behavior. And there are many subfields within that, of course. There's people who specialize in sleep, some in drug use and abuse, some in sexual behavior and all sorts of things, okay? Moving on, there are also developmental psychologists. Developmental psychologists study the development of the individual across the lifespan. So how we change basically and how we develop, you know, from the moment we're born to the moment we die. The physical changes associated with aging, let's say. Also, so not just physical changes, but changes in our cognitive skills, changes in our thinking, our moral reasoning, changes in our social behavior. We're very different when we are infants, when we're babies, the way we think, the way we interact or the lack thereof. And as we get older, right, and when we're toddlers and, you know, and then kids and teenagers, adolescents, and we get older, our thinking, our bodies change, our brain changes. Developmental psychologists study these things, but they usually specialize in one thing or another. For instance, you might specialize, let's say, in, you know, in like moral reasoning, how people's like ability to understand right and wrong, how that changes as we get older. And we'll talk about a theory of moral reasoning, and we'll talk about Piaget's theory. Piaget wanted to understand how people's ability to think develops, how it changes as we move from infancy, right, when we're, you know, just newborns to adults. Our thinking changes. You know, everything changes. We are always changing. And there are some things that come up at different stages of our life, you know, of our lives. And they study those things. And there's a whole bunch of different things, from learning disabilities, you know, to emotional behavior, psychological problems, you know, drugs, you know, changes in the brain, all kinds of things that they can study. So, you know, and if you want to focus on children, that would be child psychology, by the way, which is another class I teach. That just focuses on the development of children. okay, up until basically age 18, up until adulthood. But lifespan development or developmental psychology looks at the entire lifespan, okay? But usually people specialize in one thing, one aspect or another. Personality psychology. This looks complicated, but it's not that complicated. This image over here, where it says the 5-factor model, don't worry about that too much right now. We will talk about that later, okay? That is a theory of personality. So personality psychology, okay? It focuses on patterns of thoughts and behaviors that make each individual unique. So personality is about who we are, okay? Why we do the things we do, why we think the way we do. It is essentially about psychology and who we are and how we think and how we feel and how we behave. It's your personality, right? The early theories of personality, like Freud's theory, Maslow's theory, they want to explain how personality arises, how personality develops. More recent theories, like this one, like the 5-factor model, attempt to basically determine how personality interacts to affect behavior, how it interacts with our everyday situation to affect behavior. So for instance, how our personality traits affect how we do on the job. If you have a certain kind of personality, you're more suited to a certain kind of job, let's say. Or if you have a certain kind of personality, you're more likely to have success in school or more likely to get along better with people. So how personality basically affects, your everyday life, where it comes to work, social relationships. Modern theories focus more on that rather than trying to explain the development of our personality. It's more how personality interacts in our environment, in our social context, to determine what happens, how we think, how we feel, how we behave. And we also have social psychology. I am a social psychologist, believe it or not. I was trained as an experimental social psychologist. So I know how to do research. I know how to do experiments and all those things. I actually teach research methods, okay, which is a class just about doing research and writing APA style. So social psychologists, what do? They focus on how we interact with and relate to others. They focus on social aspects of people, right? So they'll study things like persuasion, how we're persuaded, right? We are persuaded by others or by ads that are developed by others, okay? Why we're attracted to certain people, okay? Attraction, prejudice, discrimination, racism, all those things fall under social psychology, right? How we learn those things, how we develop those things, okay? Why we help people, or some people more than others. Group behavior, lots of different things, okay? Or aggressive behavior. That was my specialty. My specialty was aggressive behavior, okay? But aggressive behavior can also be studied from a biological point of view or from a therapeutic point of view, from the aspect of child development or even developmental psychology. So a lot of different things that are studied can be studied from multiple angles, but social psychologists focus on the social situation, focuses on how our interactions with others shapes these things or interactions in the environment, okay? An example here, Stanley Milgram, which you'll learn about later. And there's an ad that he used to recruit participants for his experiment. Stanley Milgram, his research demonstrated just how far people will go in obeying orders from an authority, right? We are taught to obey authority, and how far will we go to obey authority? Will we do something that's horrible, right? Potentially killing someone just because someone of authority tells us to do so. Stanley Milgram studied stuff like that, and we'll talk about his study, a very famous study that he did. That might shock some of you if you haven't heard about it, the extent to which people are willing to actually hurt and potentially kill someone just because someone of authority tells them to do so. By the way, just think about Hitler, right? Hitler didn't kill all those millions of people with his bare hands. He gave orders. Why did that happen? How is that possible? Stanley Milgram wanted to understand that, okay? And by the way, I forgot to tell you guys that, speaking of Hitler, World War II shaped a lot of psychology a great deal. I told you guys that early on, it was Germany, Europe, basically, where a lot of the ideas were coming from, where the sciences were being born and developed. And eventually that moved to the US, and the US became the dominant place for the growth of science and psychology and all those things. Why is that? Because of Hitler. Hitler tried to kill a bunch of people, and he scared a lot of the scientists away. A lot of them were Jewish people, and he disrupted that whole thing, and a lot of people fled. you know, and some people were killed, you know, who could have contributed a lot. But those people, guess what? Where they wound up? They wound up in the US. That's how we got Einstein. Freud even came over here for a time, and other very, you know, sharp minds that shaped the development of the sciences. You know, Hitler actually, you know, did Europe a very, kind of a disfavor there, basically. You know, now, you know, the US dominates in many different areas precisely because of that. A lot of the great minds fled and wound up here in the US. And then that led to the development here of the science here. And of course, the development of other minds and and the teaching of other experts and other people in the field, you know, and that's what happens, you know, totally altered the course of history, Hitler did, in World War II. There's also something known as IO, or sports psychology. Let me tell you about IO first. Industrial organizational psychology. I saw a class offered in industrial organizational psychology, but I didn't see too many people signed up for it. You know, because I guess it's not well known, but industrial organizational psychology tries to apply psychology to the workplace. So it tries to apply psychological theories, the principles, research to industrial and organizational settings. Guess what? Those big corporations that are trying to sell you things, that develop those ads, right? Actually, that area is known as marketing, but that probably falls under industrial organizational psychology. But, you know, these corporations, they want to know, for instance, who's buying their products. That's marketing, actually, and how to sell their products. But now, actually, industrial and organizational psychology has more directly to do with the workforce. How do we make our workers more productive, right? How do we make it that they're less likely to leave and join, let's say, a rival corporation, right? How do we make it so the people from Google don't jump ship and then go join Apple instead, right? We want to keep the brightest minds in our workplace, the more productive people, and the people who are really going to help, you know, the company. But not just the brightest minds, that's tech and all that stuff, you know, that are fighting for the brightest minds in tech. But also, how do we get the most productive workers? How do we make them more productive? Simple things like lighting, for instance, has a lot to do with that. People are more productive when there's bright light. What motivates people? Is it money? Is it status? Having a certain, let's say, title? You'd be surprised. It varies depending on age. So that's what industrial organizational psychologists study. It's psychology in the workplace. And by the way, industrial organizational psychologists are the ones who make the most money in psychology. They're the ones that are the most highly paid, okay? Requires at least a master's degree. Better if you have, of course, a PhD, a doctorate, but industrial organizational psychologists, right? If you come from a big name school and you get the job as the, you know, an industrial organizational psychologist, you can, you know, go work for a big business and, you know, start making six figures right away. They're the most highly paid psychologists. There's also sports psychologists. They study psychology, you know, in sports, psychological aspects of sports performance, how to keep those players motivated, right? In the NBA, the NFL, millions of dollars being invested in those players. How do we keep them motivated, you know? How do we deal with performance anxiety? The effects of sports on their mental and emotional well-being. There's a whole team of people devoted to taking care of those athletes, doctors, psychologists, right? A lot of money invested in those people, and we want them to be in tip-top shape, not just physically, but also mentally. We want them to be able to handle all the things that are going to be thrown at them. And it's not just their job. It's also all these other demands from the outside world. Okay, all the temptation and all that stuff. Sports psychologists try to help athletes basically be at their best. There's a whole team of people, okay? There's also a sports psychologist at the lower levels as well. You don't necessarily have to work for the NBA or the NFL or something like that, but at the lower levels, right? If the, you know, school can afford it, maybe, you know, at a university or with the college athletes, or maybe even high school, or it depends on how much money the school has, okay? Whether they're gonna have a sports psychologist. There's also health psychologists. There are psychologists basically who study, you know, basically the interaction, it says, of biological, psychological, and social cultural factors. Your mental health is a matter of not just your thinking, but also your biology, right? The things that are going on socially. Your health in general, your mental health is affected by your biology, okay? psychologically what's going on, with, let's say, your relationships, others, social things like your workplace, stress, all kinds of things. So your biological health, your psychological health, and your environment, the social aspects, right, interact to determine your overall health, right? So your genetic makeup, right, your biology, right, your patterns of behavior, that's psychology, right, your relationships, that's social things, psychological stresses, all those will impact your health. So they might try to determine, how do we motivate someone, let's say, to change their behavior, so they can have better health, right? How do we motivate someone to stop smoking, or motivate someone to eat healthier and exercise? Health psychologists deal with those kind of things, right? There are reasons why people, for instance, do things that are bad for them. Let's say like drink too much. Some of it is biological. Some people are more naturally prone to become addicted to alcohol than others and more likely to be alcoholics. It's also psychological. They use it to reduce stress, for instance. It's also social. They drink because they're with their friends or because that's what they do in their culture. Moving on. There's also clinical and counseling psychologists. Clinical psychology, right, deals with the diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders. If you want to be a psychologist, chances are that's what you want. Most people who study psychology want to be clinical psychologists. Some of them do scientific research, these clinical psychologists. But there are other areas, by the way, okay? There's other ways that you can, have a career in psychology. And by the way, clinical psychology is very heavily impacted, okay? Most people want to be clinical psychologists, but only a few will be able to become clinical psychologists. So, try some of those other areas as well, okay? Counseling psychology. Those are the people who are counselors. They deal with emotional, social, vocational, health-related outcomes. Some counselors deal with helping you emotionally, deal with things. Let's say emotionally be ready, let's say to take classes or to handle relationships or your social situations, how to deal with problems that come up at home or maybe at school. Vocational, they help you pick a career and help you determine which classes would be better for you. And even with your health, how to make more healthy choices. Counselors, help people in all sorts of ways, okay? Forensic psychologists, there's many different kinds. Forensic psychologists that's psychology in the context of the justice system, right? That's forensic psychology. Psychology and the law, that's forensic psychology. So they might be involved in the assessment of a person's competency to stand trial, right? Should someone stand trial? They're mentally competent, right? Should a child be put on trial? What about someone who's, just not mentally competent or who's just is not in the right state of mind or the state of mind of a defendant, right? All that stuff. They assess and determine all those things. They consult on or help, basically legal experts and those in the law deal with child custody cases. Who should get custody of the children, right? Are they better off with their mother, with their father? How are those people handling their lives? Who's employed, who's not employed? Those kind of things. There's a lot that goes into determining who gets custody. It mostly just goes to the mother because mothers are usually better suited for raising children than fathers. Unless the mother's all messed up and then in that case, they might give the child to the father. And that does happen sometimes, okay? But usually the mother gets custody for good reason. Sentencing treatment recommendations. If somebody gets convicted, right, should this person be sentenced to prison or do they deserve treatment for, their problem, the problem that they have, Is it a situation where they can't help themselves, where they're suffering psychologically from something that makes them prone to some kind of criminal behavior? Eyewitness testimony, children's testimony, right? Forensic psychologists are involved in that as well, testifying in court about how memory works. Or, or children testifying, should they testify or not? What kind of evidence, can we get from children and that kind of stuff. So it's psychology and the law. That's forensic psychology, okay? But for just about all of these, you need an advanced degree, at least a master's. Doctorate is even better. If you only get a BA in psychology, you might get a job in the field of psychology, but most likely you will not. You usually need an advanced degree, okay, to get into some of these areas. And here are references. I kept showing you guys some citations, and things like that. So, and here are the references. Here are those citations, those authors which I cited and how to reference them in APA style, just an example. And I'll keep showing you things. And then by the time I directly teach you about this stuff, it will be easier because you will have seen it before. You won't be seeing it for the first time. Okay, that is it. I'm going to stop recording.